I thought I married into a loving, sophisticated family. At Sunday dinners, my mother-in-law called me her second daughter, and my brother-in-law used to thank me for holding the family together. Then one morning, I got a bank alert. $500,000 had been transferred to Brett, my husband's younger brother. Not a word to me. A week later, my in-laws arrived at my doorstep with 4 suitcases and said, "We're moving in." No question, no warning, just entitlement wrapped in smiles. And that was the moment I realized I was never family. I was just the furniture. For the first 5 years of our marriage, I genuinely believed I'd found a second family. Brandon's parents welcomed me with the kind of warmth I thought only existed in Hallmark movies. His mother, Vivian, was a retired school principal who baked lemon pound cake from scratch and called me sweetheart. So often I almost believed she meant it. His father, George, was quieter, a former Navy officer who still ironed his shirts with precision and opened car doors like a gentleman. Brett, Brandon's younger brother, was a bit of a wanderer, a failed tech startup here, a consulting gig there, but he always greeted me with that effortless charm. I thought we were close. I thought I belonged. Every Sunday, we had dinner together. At my house, not theirs. It started as a convenience. Our kitchen was larger, but slowly, subtly, it became the unspoken norm. I cooked, I hosted, I cleaned up, and they praised me for it. "You're the glue of this family," Vivian said one evening while sipping her wine. "You make this house a home," Brandon added, kissing my cheek. I smiled, proud, even flattered. But what I didn't realize then was that glue doesn't get celebrated. It gets used. The night of our 5th wedding anniversary, Brandon threw a surprise party at a rooftop restaurant in Manhattan. Candlelight, jazz band, rose petals, the works. Everyone was there. Toasts were made, laughter echoed against the glass windows. Then Vivian stood up, lifted her glass, and said, "Tonight, we celebrate not just Lauren and Brandon, but the future of this family." She turned to Brett. "Darling, you've always had the spirit of an entrepreneur. We believe in you." George handed him an envelope. Brett opened it, blinked, then grinned. Brandon clapped him on the back. $500,000, he whispered to me. "Seed money." I blinked too. "For what?" I asked, voice barely above the music. "A new venture Brett's starting." They didn't want to say anything until the paperwork was finalized. Paperwork. The same word on the folder I had signed weeks ago, one Brandon had said, was just standard financial stuff. I remembered the way he had distracted me, kissing my neck, joking about dinner reservations, as I signed my name without reading the fine print. I didn't say anything that night. I smiled. I toasted. I watched Brett kiss Vivian on the cheek and promise he wouldn't let them down. I watched George pat Brandon's shoulder like they were co-conspirators in a generational mission, and I felt the walls of my reality begin to shift. The next morning, I received a text. "We'll be arriving Thursday, movers coming at 10. No name. Just that. I assumed it was spam, a wrong number. Then Thursday came. A white moving truck pulled into the driveway. 2 men began unloading boxes. Then came Vivian's Lexus, then George's Buick. They didn't knock. They walked in with keys I didn't know they had. Vivian beamed. "We didn't want to bother you at work. This will be so good for all of us." I stood in the foyer, frozen. "What is this?" George gave me a smile like I was overreacting. "Just until we sell the Connecticut house. It's too much for us now. Too many stairs." Brandon came in 10 minutes later, out of breath. "They just need a place to land for a bit," he said, eyes avoiding mine. "Let's not make a big deal." But it was a big deal. They moved into the guest room, took over the upstairs den, brought their dog, their cleaning lady, their noise. They brought their world into mine without asking. Every room I walked into suddenly felt occupied. I could smell Vivian's perfume on the towels. George adjusted the thermostat without asking. Brett came by more often, bringing business plans and staying late. And Brandon, my Brandon, just watched, smiled, deflected. "You're overreacting," he said when I brought it up. "They're family." So, one night, after a long day of pretending everything was fine, I opened the closet in our bedroom to get a sweater and noticed something odd. The small lockbox we never used, the one I kept old cards and passport copies in, was gone. Replaced. I opened it. Inside were envelopes, documents, and keys I didn't recognize. At the top of the stack was a deed, our house deed. Only it wasn't in my name anymore, just Brandon's. My hands shook as I flipped through the papers, the signatures, the dates, the notary stamp. It was all there, all legal, and none of it involved me. I heard a soft knock. Vivian's voice followed. Too sweet. "Just making tea, dear. Want some?" I said nothing, because in that moment, as the kettle hissed and the voices downstairs floated upward, I knew. This wasn't my home anymore. It never had been. I didn't cry, not when I saw the deed, not when I realized my name was gone, and not when Vivian offered me tea like nothing had shifted. I moved through the next few days as if I were sleepwalking, storing every word, every glance, every too casual comment into a mental vault. If they thought I was going to scream, they'd be disappointed. I wasn't going to give them a performance. I was going to give them silence and consequences. That night, while Brandon snored beside me, I slipped out of bed and went downstairs. I opened my laptop and logged into the county records portal. Our property address brought up a list of document filings, sales history, liens, updates. There it was, a transfer of ownership dated exactly 2 weeks ago, signed by both of us. Only I had been in Boston on a work trip the day it was notarized. My heart didn't race. My hands didn't shake. I copied the document, downloaded the PDF, and emailed it to myself with the subject line, "Proof." The next morning, I drove to the county clerk's office and requested certified copies of every document filed under our names in the past 6 months. The clerk, a woman in her 60s with kind eyes, handed me a thick envelope without question. As I walked out, I imagined what she would think if she knew. That the woman in heels and a tailored blazer was quietly unearthing her own erasure. Back in my car, I opened the folder. The signature stared back at me. My name, written in a neat, familiar curve. But it wasn't mine. It was perfect. Too perfect. I'd signed thousands of papers in my life. No one signs the same way twice. This was a scan, digital, pasted cleanly onto multiple pages. And there it was, on the bottom right corner of the original deed transfer, my forged name, carefully outlined beside Brandon's real one. Above it, the notary's stamp, a name I didn't recognize. They'd done it while I was away, used a scanned signature file I'd sent Brandon years ago for a lease agreement. I remembered emailing it to him from work. I never imagined it would end up here, on a legal document that stripped me of everything. When I got home, Vivian was arranging flowers in the living room. Hydrangeas, blue and white, my least favorite. "Running errands?" she asked without looking up. "Just clearing my head," I said. She smiled faintly. "That's good. These days are heavy." I smiled back and walked past her. In my office, I opened a new browser tab and searched for a lawyer. Discreet, female, experienced in high-asset divorces. I found someone who specialized in quiet exits. Her assistant scheduled me for a consultation 2 days later. That night, Brandon suggested we host another Sunday dinner. Something to bring the family together. I nodded. He kissed my forehead. "You're always the heart of us," he whispered. The next day, I drove across town to a co-working space and rented a private desk. I filed paperwork to form an LLC under my maiden name. I moved the bulk of my savings into a business account under the company. I shifted stocks, liquidated mutual funds, and changed the beneficiary on my life insurance. It took 3 days. By Friday, every financial asset I personally owned was under a shell company tied to me, and only me. The lawyer, Marissa Cole, was as sharp as advertised. She wore no makeup, spoke like she'd argued with billionaires and won, and listened without interruption as I explained what had happened. "You have more power than you think," she said when I finished. "But you'll need to be strategic. Emotional decisions are their game. You're going to play a different one." She outlined my options. If I filed now, Brandon could freeze joint accounts, contest asset transfers, try to paint me as vindictive. But if I stayed quiet, gathered evidence, moved slowly, I could control the exit. Silent leverage, she called it. A quiet war. I agreed. That weekend, Vivian hosted a tea party for her book club at my dining table. George watched sports in the den. Brett strutted around with a startup pitch deck like he was the next Elon Musk. Brandon grilled steaks like nothing had changed. I played my role, smiled, served, listened. But on Monday, I asked our housekeeper to clean the master bedroom and please be thorough. When she finished, I walked in and pretended to inspect her work. That's when I noticed it. An edge of fabric sticking out beneath the armoire in the guest room Vivian had unofficially claimed as her own. It was a small burgundy pouch, inside a miniature lockbox, and inside that box, a pile of old letters, a set of spare keys, and one folded sheet of paper. It was a note, handwritten, clearly intended for George. It said, "If she finds out about the signature, delay. Say it was a misunderstanding. She gets emotional. Play the sympathy. Do not let her escalate. Lauren is the dangerous one." The word dangerous was underlined twice. I sat on the edge of the bed and read it 3 times. They weren't afraid of losing me. They were afraid of what I'd become if I stopped playing nice. And for the first time since the mask cracked, I smiled. They thought they'd won, that I would shrink into silence, smothered under layers of domestic obligation and false gratitude. So I gave them exactly what they expected, another invitation. "I thought it might be nice," I said at dinner, pouring wine into Vivian's glass. "A little family getaway before fall sets in. I booked the Montauk house for the weekend, just us." Brandon beamed. "That's perfect, babe." Vivian reached for my hand. "You are such a blessing, Lauren. Always thinking of everyone." It took them 3 hours to pack. It took me 3 days to prep the house. The Montauk property wasn't new. It was a quiet oceanfront home I'd purchased last year under my LLC, originally intended as a creative retreat. What they didn't know was that the home had recently been fitted with discrete cameras in nearly every room. The den, the porch, the guest suite. Not for security, for clarity. By Friday afternoon, we were sipping cocktails on the back deck. The ocean breeze softened everything. George fell asleep on the couch. Brett hovered near the fire pit, trying to impress Vivian with some new investment app. Brandon grilled, and I, always the hostess, played my part. Vivian sipped her drink, leaned closer, and whispered, "You know, it's exhausting keeping Brett focused. If only he'd settle down, marry someone with stability, like you." I tilted my head. "You wanted him to marry for stability?" She laughed. "You think men in this family get rich on their own? Brandon wouldn't have made partner if I hadn't pulled strings." I smiled politely. "Really? Oh, sweetheart. This world doesn't reward talent. It rewards placement. Brett's not dumb. He just needs structure. I told him if he wants his full stake in the trust, he needs a wife with pedigree, like Brandon has you." I sipped slowly. "So I was a model?" Vivian winked. "Don't take it personally. We all play roles." That night, I watched the footage from the study upstairs, volume low, headphones in. Vivian's voice was clear, confident. No hesitation, no filters. She even named the firm that handled the trust Brett was promised, one I had ties to through an old client. The next morning, I served coffee and croissants with a smile. "Another beach day?" I asked. George grunted. Brett was still in bed. Vivian yawned. "You've set the bar too high, dear. No one can compete with you." Before we left Montauk, I backed up every file. I labeled each video by timestamp, room, and voice. I created transcripts. Then I emailed everything to Marissa, my lawyer, with a simple note, "Begin draft." The blog post went live 3 days later. It wasn't sensational, no names, no insults, just a careful, composed narrative. A woman whose contributions were minimized, whose financial stake in her marriage was manipulated, whose loyalty was used against her. The title, "Married but Not in Control." Within hours, it was shared over 1,000 times. Within a day, 10,000. Women from across the country commented with stories of being sidelined, dismissed, financially erased. I never said Vivian, I never said Brandon, but everyone who knew us knew. The letter from Marissa followed. It wasn't a lawsuit, not yet. It was a warning, a list of infractions, a declaration of documented evidence, a call for immediate negotiation of assets and separation of properties. Vivian called me that night. "How dare you make us look like villains?" Her voice trembled, not from fear, but from fury. "I didn't name you," I said calmly. "I told my story." "You're ungrateful. You forged my signature." Silence, then a low, bitter laugh. "Darling, women like you end up very rich and very alone." I hung up without responding. The next morning, Brett posted a rebuttal on his own blog. The real story behind the silence. He painted himself as the scapegoat, claiming I'd always resented his close relationship with Brandon, that I'd manipulated the family into isolating themselves from the only son who tried to help. He ended it with, "Control is a dangerous drug, and Lauren's addicted." The internet lit up. Lines were drawn. Some believed him, many didn't. But I didn't reply. I didn't need to, because the recordings were already scheduled for release, and I hadn't even opened the next lockbox yet. I never raised my voice. Not once. But my silence had started to echo in rooms they couldn't control. The reporter was young. Too young, I thought, to be trusted with something so layered. But when she came to my office and sat across from me with nothing but a legal pad and an old-fashioned tape recorder, I knew she wasn't chasing scandal. She was chasing structure, truth with backbone. "I'm not here to destroy anyone," I told her. She nodded. "Then let's illuminate them." The article came out a week later, page 3 of the Sunday print edition, front and center online. Behind the gold walls, a daughter-in-law's hidden battle. My name wasn't listed in the title, but it didn't need to be. The story traced the shape of a marriage warped by entitlement, a woman whose financial identity was slowly extracted under the guise of love, and the family who celebrated her usefulness while erasing her worth. Screenshots of the notarized deed, the forged signature, and even select quotes from the Montauk recordings made the piece impossible to ignore. By Monday, my inbox exploded. Not just sympathy, validation, messages from women who had signed away pensions, homes, retirement accounts. Some never even knew they were doing it. Some had, silently, out of fear, out of love. I was no longer just telling a story. I had become a signal flare. 2 days later, I appeared on Money, Marriage, and Power, a podcast hosted by a former divorce attorney turned financial activist. She asked careful questions. I gave careful answers. But what made people stay wasn't the legality. It was the lived-in weight of each sentence. "I wasn't betrayed in a moment," I said. "I was betrayed in layers, smiles, holidays, toasts. And every time I said nothing, I became easier to erase." Vivian's voice returned before the podcast ended, this time through a voicemail forwarded from her tax attorney. Apparently, someone had flagged the $500K transfer to Brett. The IRS had opened a case. She was told to expect an audit. I knew she'd panic. She'd always liked order, paper trails that obeyed her logic. But the money hadn't come through a trust. It had come through her own liquidated bonds, and she'd listed it as a business investment. Brett never filed the venture, and he never paid taxes on it. They were unraveling themselves. Meanwhile, Brett's startup had launched its app prematurely. Bugs, glitches, fake reviews. A forum thread appeared claiming the entire thing was a pyramid scheme. The investors, 3 of them ex-military, 1 of them retired intelligence, weren't amused. The trust fund they'd borrowed against? Frozen. I didn't make calls. I didn't gloat. I sent a single email to Marissa. Time to move. The next motion we filed wasn't for divorce. It was for asset recovery. We submitted full documentation proving misappropriation of marital funds, forgery, and concealed transfers. Brandon tried to delay, but the notary's stamp was fake. The county confirmed it. Vivian's printer had been used to generate every signature page. The house they were living in, the one they'd claimed as ours, had been refinanced under fraudulent terms. Brandon had used my credit score to secure the rate. I'd never signed a single form. When the case went public, no one spoke directly to me, but I heard the whispers. Friends of Brandon's began distancing themselves. One sent me a card. I always knew you were the smart one. No return address. Then came the lawsuit against George and Vivian, filed by their own accountant. Tax fraud, misrepresentation, investor deception. Brett went quiet online. His LinkedIn disappeared. Brandon tried to act confused. But the final blow came when the court sent notice that the Montauk house, once borrowed for the family retreat, was in fact legally and solely mine. The original LLC paperwork confirmed it. The utilities had been paid from my account. All property taxes filed under my maiden name. The judge ruled it untouchable, which meant when the family lawyer requested a list of assets Lauren might release for compromise, I had one answer: the very home they were living in, and I wasn't releasing it. The first time Brandon confronted me, it wasn't in court or through his lawyer. It was in our old bedroom, the one I no longer slept in. I had come by to collect the last of my clothes, quiet and deliberate, when I heard the click of the door. "You blew up everything," he said. His voice was low but coiled tight, like a spring wound too far. "You made us look like criminals." I didn't look up. I folded the last blouse into my bag and zipped it shut. "You made yourself look like criminals," I said. "I just stopped covering for it." He laughed, bitter and small. "You think this makes you noble? You think it makes you strong?" "I think it makes me free." Brandon stepped closer, the space between us buzzing with old, frayed history. "You ruined this family. My parents stole from me," I cut in, finally meeting his eyes. "And so did you." He flinched, just slightly, but enough. He wasn't angry because of the exposure. He was angry because I'd dismantled the illusion, because I wasn't playing along anymore, because I had outmaneuvered him without ever raising my voice. 2 days later, in Discovery, Marissa handed me an email chain, dated 2 years prior. It was from Brandon to a corporate law firm in Connecticut. He had inquired about asset isolation prior to no-fault dissolution, citing marital imbalance in income contribution and requesting guidance on how to retain full ownership of real estate purchased jointly. The email ended with, "My wife has no idea. I want to keep it that way until I'm ready." I stared at the screen for a long time, not because I was shocked, but because a part of me, quiet and shamed, had always suspected. When Marissa asked if I wanted to include it in our motion, I said no. Instead, I printed it and handed it to Brandon in mediation. He scanned it in silence. His lawyer stiffened beside him, clearly unaware of the document's existence. "This is what you meant when you said I made you feel powerless?" I asked, keeping my tone steady. "You were planning an exit before you even told me you were unhappy." Brandon didn't respond, but I saw it. The flicker of panic, then shame, then something colder settle into his features. Defense. Survival. "People change," he said finally. "Some of us evolve," I replied. "Others just get better at pretending." Outside the conference room, the building's glass facade reflected the city back at us. Clean, geometric, impersonal. Inside, it was all negotiation tables and clipped voices. We sat down for the final mediation the following Thursday. No courtroom, just us, our lawyers, and a mediator with glasses too large for his face. The assets had already been traced. What remained was a matter of division. Brandon's team asked for leniency, a settlement, a partial return of contributed equity. Marissa slid forward a single sheet of paper. "No," I said. The mediator blinked. "I'm sorry?" "I'm not giving anything back," I said, "not because I want to punish anyone, but because none of it belonged to them to begin with." Brandon's lawyer leaned in. "You realize this means—" "I realize," I said, calm. "He gets to walk away with his name. I get to walk away with my autonomy. That's the deal." The mediator nodded. "So, zero compensation exchange?" "Zero," I confirmed. We signed the documents in silence, each page closing a chapter he thought he'd be the one to end. Afterwards, as we walked out into the hallway, Brandon stopped me. His voice was softer now, quieter. "Did you ever love me?" he asked. It was the first honest question he'd asked me in years. I looked at him. This man I once thought was my anchor, and realized something painful and liberating. I had loved him, or at least the idea of him, the version he let me see when it served him. "Yes," I said, "but that woman doesn't exist anymore." He nodded, just once, then walked away. And I didn't watch him go. The first morning in my new apartment, I didn't set an alarm. Sunlight crept in through floor-to-ceiling windows, painting gold across the hardwood. The silence was crisp, not the brittle hush of avoidance, but a kind of sacred quiet, like the pause between breaths. The condo was mine, legally, spiritually, entirely. No hidden contracts, no shared signatures, no compromise. I had picked every detail, from the matte black fixtures in the kitchen to the deep emerald velvet of the reading chair by the window. It was the first space I ever occupied without shrinking, and it was there, in that chair, where I began to write. I didn't start with the betrayal. I started with the blindness. How easy it had been to trade instincts for security, to confuse control with care. I wrote about the way entitlement dresses itself in praise, how manipulation is rarely loud. I wrote about documents, loopholes, moments of silence that echo years later. It wasn't rage that filled the pages. It was clarity. By the time the manuscript was done, I had lived it twice, once in pain, once in power. The book was called Invisible Lines. It wasn't a memoir, it was a mirror. It sold quietly at first, word of mouth, book clubs, shelves in indie shops tucked between self-help and finance. Then it found its tribe, women who had nodded along at dinner tables while swallowing doubt, who had smiled through manipulation disguised as love. The first email came from a nonprofit in Chicago. "Would you be interested in speaking to our group?" The next came from London, then Toronto, then Sydney. Eventually, I formed my own. Married but Not Blind began as a single workshop in a co-working space downtown. 10 women, each with stories she hadn't told out loud before. We talked about autonomy, credit, boundaries, soft control. They cried. Then they built plans. Some opened accounts, some filed quietly. All left knowing they weren't crazy. The workshops became monthly, then quarterly retreats, then a full curriculum. A few years in, we hosted a summit, 1,000 women, a ballroom in D.C. I stood on stage, heart-thudding, and told them what no one had told me early enough. They may strip your name from the deed, but they cannot write you out of your own story. The room rose with applause. Later that evening, I opened my inbox and found an email with no subject line. It was from a man I didn't recognize. A managing partner at a mid-sized investment firm, recently divorced. He had read Invisible Lines after his teenage daughter left it on the counter. "I want to fund women like you," he wrote. "Women who don't ask for permission anymore. Let's build something no one can erase." He attached a pitch deck and a question. "Would you co-found a female-led investment firm?" I didn't answer right away. Some victories deserve space to breathe. I walked the city for hours that night, shoes clicking on concrete, coat tucked tight. For the first time in years, I wasn't walking away from anything. I was walking toward it. Years passed. Brandon disappeared from public life. His consultancy folded after a quiet scandal involving falsified reports. Brett filed for bankruptcy twice. Last I heard, he was bartending in Austin. Vivian, once so regal, now lived in a private care facility. No visitors, no assets, no leverage. I didn't send flowers. I didn't send anything. Not out of malice, but because I had no use for retroactive revenge. Peace was enough, and peace doesn't beg to be witnessed. One afternoon, after a guest lecture at a university in Boston, I was approached by a girl no older than 10. She held a copy of my book in both hands, oversized for her frame, and looked up at me with eyes that reminded me of my own. "Did you really forgive them?" she asked. The room quieted behind us. I knelt down, took the book from her, and ran my hand across the worn cover. "I forgave myself," I said. "That was the hardest part." She nodded like she understood. Maybe she did. As she turned to leave, I looked around the auditorium filled with daughters, mothers, sisters, and strangers. None of them knew the whole story. They didn't need to. I had lived it, and I had rewritten the ending.